Good evening, everyone. This is Aaron Mesh with Willamette Week. I'm here with John Schlosser. He's a private practice criminal defense attorney here in Portland. And criminal defense in this city just got a little bit more interesting after the past weekend when, thanks to a group coordinated effort that Governor Kate Brown put together to respond to the arrival of the Proud Boys in the city, well, thanks to that effort, there was the deputization of, I believe, 48 Portland police officers who have essentially become legally U.S. Marshals. And so I'm talking to John, who occasionally represents Portland protesters in criminal cases, about what it means to suddenly discover that the officer who arrested you is not just a Portland cop, but a U.S. Marshal. John, what's it mean?
If you're simply arrested, for the most part, it shouldn't mean anything unless there is some sort of physical altercation. I mean, the premise here was my understanding is to just try and limit people's ability to protest and speak their voice by threat of federal prosecution for assaulting a federal officer, right, which carries significant amount of prison time. So if you're simply arrested by the officer for disorderly conduct or something like that, it hopefully shouldn't matter. But as you know, we see from time to time, things get escalated, and maybe by the protester, likely by an officer, where then that person is subsequently charged with assaulting or resisting, and so it creates a very powerful weapon in the government's war on free speech.
Well, I'm going to get dragged on Twitter for asking the question today, but why is it a war on free speech if you just hit a cop?
Well, it's a fair point, right? It's a fair issue to raise up. If your only goal is to go out and punch a cop, right? Sure, yeah. I mean, that's something that just, generally speaking, we don't allow. We don't allow people to just punch anybody, right? At least in Oregon, and so. I get it, but the stated objective behind deputizing these officers was specifically to respond to, at least in this instance, we'll put aside the Oregon State police officers, but this past weekend was to create that threat towards the protesters that they might get charged federally, right? And the purpose of those people being out there was to ostensibly exercise their right to free speech, to say whatever they want to say about what's going on in the political climate in the country. So if you're just out there randomly deputizing law enforcement officers, okay, fine, I guess, that's not necessarily targeted at free speech. But in this case, where the response was specific towards the scheduled events, then it certainly seems to be.
Well, how would you advise a client to behave differently given the circumstances, or at all?
Well, I mean, every time I give a know your rights or advise somebody on something like this, I try to warn them that, passive resistance is literally the only thing you can do, because everything else will get turned into an attempted assault, resisting arrest, interfering, and even passive resistance sometimes gets turned into interfering by officers. So it's so you have to consider that, but you are allowed to use a reasonable amount of force to defend yourself, against an unlawful use of force against you, right? So you can have a valid self-defense claim against an officer if they are using an unreasonable amount of force in a particular scenario. Of course, that becomes exceedingly difficult when you are surrounded by 1,000 cops beating on you, right? And you try to protect yourself from getting beat up. You accidentally hit a cop because you're trying to do this, you get charged with an assault, right? And in Portland, where the law enforcement just refuses to wear body cameras. I mean, by and large, it's almost impossible to prove anything other than what the officers are writing. I mean, fortunately, we have a great group of journalists out there at all these rallies, trying to record everything as best they can, as long as they're not getting themselves beat up. But
well, isn't the legitimate concern that, say, come the 10th day of November, there may be riots in the streets regarding the re-election of Donald Trump through legitimate or illegitimate means, and suddenly there are a lot more officers who carry the weight of the federal government and federal charging decisions against people protesting the newly anointed czar?
yeah, I mean, that's a very reasonable fear. But if um, if the law enforcement or the people who are in charge, if they have issues about this, then all they got to do is bench these officers until the first of the year, right? And I mean, that gets into why I think it's reasonable for the government or local governments to be raising this issue with the federal government, because you are now hamstringing our ability to enforce local laws by refusing to acknowledge our request, right? The federal government is not supposed to be able to just come in and force the states to do whatever they want whenever they want, right? They have things like money to entice the states to do what they want, but they are not supposed to just come in and preempt things. And I was trying to find what statutory authority permitted this. I wasn't able to in the limited amount of time I had to look. I'd love to see what this falls under, and how these time designations are made. You know, how long somebody gets deputized for, uh, um, and things like that. But I think the state should be pissed. It's just they're going to be pissed for different reasons than the general populace.